When you think about the first civilization, what comes to mind? For most people, it's Sumer, the land between two rivers, Mesopotamia. Around 4000 BCE, the Sumerians built the first cities we officially recognize, Uruk, Eridu. They invented writing, created complex governments, erected massive temples called ziggurats. They're in every textbook, every documentary about ancient history, the beginning of civilization, the dawn of the urban age. Except, what if they weren't the beginning? What if Sumer was just the first chapter we decided to remember? See, there's something strange about how we think about human history. We act like civilization just appeared suddenly in Mesopotamia, as if humans spent 200,000 years as simple hunter-gatherers, and then suddenly, out of nowhere, decided to build cities and invent agriculture. But the archaeological evidence keeps whispering something different, something older, something we almost forgot entirely. Before Sumer, there were other cities, other civilizations, places where humans gathered in thousands, built monuments that still stand today, created complex societies that thrived and vanished, leaving behind only fragments, echoes in stone, shadows beneath the earth. These aren't mythical places like Atlantis. These are real sites that archaeologists have found, excavated, dated, and tried desperately to understand. But they don't fit the narrative we were taught. They're too old, too sophisticated, too inconvenient for the neat timeline of human progress we like to imagine. Some of these forgotten cities are buried under meters of sand and soil, hidden for millennia until a shepherd stumbles on a strange stone or a farmer's plow catches on something that shouldn't be there. Others are drowned beneath the waves, lost when the Ice Age ended and the seas rose to swallow entire worlds. A few are hiding in plain sight, megalithic mysteries that we've looked at for centuries without understanding what they really were or how impossibly ancient they actually are. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and tell me, where are you right now? What time is it there? I love checking the comments and seeing Tokyo at sunrise, London at midnight, Sao Paulo in the afternoon, all listening to the same story about our shared, forgotten past. The deeper archaeologists dig, literally and figuratively, the more they find that challenges everything we thought we knew about when civilization began. Every decade brings new discoveries that push the timeline back further. A temple complex that's 6,000 years older than Stonehenge. A city without streets that housed 10,000 people when Sumer was still empty marshland. Evidence of agriculture thousands of years before it was supposed to exist. Sophisticated societies that rose and fell and left almost nothing behind except questions. This is a journey into deep time, into the centuries and millennia before the civilizations we remember, before Egypt, before Babylon, before the first cuneiform tablets were pressed into clay. Back when the world looked different, when coastlines were hundreds of miles from where they are now, when vast forests grew where deserts stretch today. We're going to explore cities that humanity forgot, not because they weren't important, not because they weren't real, but because they existed so long ago that even their memory faded into myth before writing was invented to preserve them. These are the civilizations that came before the beginning we know, and the most unsettling part, we almost miss them entirely. If not for a few curious archaeologists willing to dig where they weren't supposed to, willing to question the accepted timeline, willing to believe their own evidence even when it seemed impossible, we might never have known these places existed at all. So settle in. Let the world outside fade away. We're going back, way back, before Sumer, before the cities we remember, to the first cities humanity forgot. Picture a dusty hilltop in southeastern Turkey, 1994. A shepherd named Savak Yildiz is watching his flocks when he notices something strange sticking out of the soil. Not just any rock. This one has markings, deliberate shapes that shouldn't exist in nature. He mentions it to a team of archaeologists working nearby. They come to investigate, expecting maybe a Byzantine cemetery or a medieval structure. Nothing special. What they found instead would completely dismantle everything we thought we knew about human civilization. The first excavations revealed massive stone pillars arranged in circles. T-shaped monoliths, some weighing up to 20 tons, carved with intricate reliefs of animals: foxes, lions, scorpions, vultures, snakes. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, sophisticated beyond anything that should exist at this site. But the real shock came when they dated the structures. 11,600 years old. Some levels possibly pushing 12,000 years. Let that sink in for a moment. This site was ancient when the first stones of Stonehenge were being laid. It was old when the Egyptian pyramids were being designed. It predated pottery, metalworking, and the wheel. According to everything archaeology had established about human development, Göbekli Tepe shouldn't exist. Because here's the thing. Before Göbekli Tepe was discovered, we had a very clean narrative about how civilization developed. It went like this. First, humans learned agriculture around 10,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent. Growing crops allowed them to settle down, which led to food surpluses, which created free time, which enabled specialization, which allowed for art, religion, and monumental architecture. Agriculture came first, then civilization followed. Simple, logical, easy to understand. Göbekli Tepe flipped that entire sequence on its head. The people who built this place were hunter-gatherers. They hadn't domesticated plants or animals yet. There's no evidence of permanent settlements nearby, no trash heaps from sustained habitation, no grinding stones for processing grain. These weren't farmers taking a break from their fields to build a temple. These were nomadic peoples, still following game animals, still gathering wild plants, still living the lifestyle humans had maintained for hundreds of thousands of years. And yet somehow they organized themselves to quarry, transport, carve, and erect stones that weigh as much as modern trucks, without metal tools, without wheels, without draft animals. Using stone hammers and probably wooden levers, they shaped limestone blocks with precision that would challenge modern sculptors. The site covers roughly 22 acres, and only about 5% has been excavated so far. Ground-penetrating radar suggests there are at least 20 additional circular structures still buried, maybe more. Each circle is formed by these T-shaped pillars, some reaching 18 feet tall, arranged in rings with two taller pillars at the center. The pillars aren't just functional, they're art. Detailed three-dimensional carvings of animals cover their surfaces. Not random doodles, but carefully executed representations showing remarkable anatomical accuracy. But here's what makes it even stranger. The carvings show animals that weren't native to the region at that time. Some researchers have identified species that would have required long-distance travel to observe. This suggests the builders either had extensive trade networks or were themselves highly mobile, gathering knowledge across vast territories, the same way those post-bottleneck populations maintained connections across hundreds of miles. These late Stone Age peoples were creating information networks that spanned ecosystems. Then there's the question of organization. Moving 20-ton stones requires coordination. You need teams of people working together, following instructions, understanding roles. You need planning, logistics, probably some form of leadership hierarchy. The standard model said this kind of social complexity only emerged after agriculture created settled communities and food surpluses. But Göbekli Tepe says otherwise. These people developed complex social structures while still living as hunter-gatherers. Maybe even more remarkable is what happened to Göbekli Tepe when it was finished. They buried it, deliberately, carefully, completely. The builders filled in the structures with thousands of tons of soil and debris, creating the artificial hill that would hide the site for 11,000 years. This wasn't destruction or abandonment. This was intentional preservation, like they were sealing a time capsule. Why would anyone invest generations of labor into building something extraordinary, only to bury it? The theories multiply in the darkness of that question. Some researchers think Göbekli Tepe was an astronomical observatory, aligned to track celestial events. The pillars might mark solstices, equinoxes, or the rising of particular stars. Ancient peoples were obsessed with the sky. It was their calendar, their clock, their connection to the cosmos. Maybe Göbekli Tepe was their cathedral to the heavens. Others suggest it was a pilgrimage site. a place where scattered hunter-gatherer bands would gather for seasonal ceremonies, share knowledge, arrange marriages, conduct rituals that reinforce social bonds across tribal boundaries. The lack of permanent habitation supports this. Nobody lived there. They came, performed whatever sacred functions the site served, and left. Year after year, generation after generation, adding new circles, carving new pillars, maintaining traditions that connected them to their ancestors. Some archaeologists have proposed something even more radical. Maybe Göbekli Tepe didn't just benefit from agriculture. Maybe it caused agriculture. Think about it. You have these seasonal gatherings where hundreds or thousands of people congregate. They need to be fed. Wild game and foraged plants might not be enough. So people start deliberately planting high-yield grasses near the site. They start managing wild animal populations, culling some, protecting others. Over generations, this proto-agriculture becomes systematic. The temple comes first, then farming develops to support the religious practice. It's a chicken and egg problem that rewrites the origins of civilization. Maybe we didn't build temples because we became civilized. Maybe we became civilized because we wanted to build temples. But none of these theories fully explain the animal carvings. Why these specific creatures? Why such precise anatomical detail? Some of the pillars show arrangements of animals that suggest symbolic meaning, possibly early constellation maps or mythological narratives. There are anthropomorphic figures too. Pillar 43, the so-called vulture stone, shows what might be a headless human surrounded by birds. Some researchers see this as evidence of sky burial practices, where the dead were left exposed for scavengers. Others interpret it as astronomical symbolism, possibly recording a cometary impact event. The truth is, we don't know. We can excavate the stones, date the construction layers, analyze the tool marks and animal bones, but we can't excavate meaning. The people who built Göbekli Tepe left no written records, no legends preserved by later cultures. Whatever knowledge they possessed, whatever stories they told around fires while carving those stones, it vanished when they buried their creation. And that's perhaps the most haunting aspect of Göbekli Tepe. It represents a sophisticated culture with advanced organizational capabilities, artistic traditions, and possibly astronomical knowledge. They built something that has survived 11,600 years. Yet we don't know their names, their language, their myths, or even why they disappeared. Somewhere between the construction of Göbekli Tepe and the rise of the first cities we recognize, their cultural continuity was broken. The knowledge was lost. Unless it wasn't. Unless some of those hunter-gatherers who gathered at Göbekli Tepe for ceremonies eventually settled nearby permanently, developing the agricultural practices that would spread across the Fertile Crescent. Unless their descendants became the Sumerians, the Egyptians, the people who would build the first cities we remember. Maybe Göbekli Tepe wasn't a dead end. Maybe it was a beginning, buried under dirt and time, waiting for a shepherd to stumble across it and remind us that our story starts earlier than we ever imagined. But Göbekli Tepe wasn't alone. As archaeologists began looking with new eyes, they found something else. Another ancient settlement, even more bizarre in its own way. A city without streets, where people entered their homes through the roof. Now let's jump forward to around 7,400 BC, to a flat plain in what's now central Turkey. The landscape here doesn't look like much today. Dry grasslands, distant mountains, agricultural fields stretching to the horizon. But if you could stand here 9,000 years ago, you'd see something that would break your understanding of what ancient humans were supposed to be capable of. A city, not a village, not a town. A city of 8,000 people. No streets, no doors, no public spaces. Just a vast honeycomb of mud brick houses packed so tightly together that their walls literally touched, creating a continuous urban surface broken only by the rectangular outlines of individual homes. This was Çatalhöyük, and nothing about it makes sense according to what we thought we knew about early civilization. Here's the first thing that would confuse you if you could somehow visit. Where do you enter? You're standing at the edge of this sprawling settlement, looking at what appears to be an unbroken expanse of flat rooftops, stretching hundreds of feet in every direction. There are no gates, No walls surrounding the city, but also no obvious way in. The exterior houses present completely blank facades to the outside world. No windows, no doors, just solid mud brick walls. Then you notice the ladders, dozens of them protruding from holes in the rooftops. That's how you get into Çatalhöyük. You climb onto the roof, descend through an opening into the interior, and suddenly you're inside someone's home. The rooftops were the streets. That's where people walked, where they moved between houses, where they went about their daily business. The ground level didn't exist as public space at all. Think about what this means. 8,000 people living in what amounts to a single massive structure, entering and exiting through their roofs, moving across each other's homes to get anywhere. The intimacy would have been suffocating by modern standards. Every journey required crossing someone else's living space. Privacy as we understand it simply didn't exist, but here's where it gets stranger. When archaeologists began excavating Çatalhöyük in the 1960s, they expected to find what you always find in ancient cities: elite quarters, bigger houses for important people, administrative centers where decisions were made, religious buildings separate from domestic spaces, workshops clustered in specific districts. The usual hierarchical organization that shows up everywhere humans build cities. They found none of that. The houses are remarkably uniform in size, about 25 square meters each, all built to the same basic plan. Some have slightly nicer decorations, some have more elaborate shrines, but there are no mansions, no obvious seats of power, no palaces, no temples that stand apart from ordinary dwellings. Everyone, from the most skilled artisan to the newest arrival, seems to have lived in essentially the same kind of structure. This uniformity persisted for over 1,400 years. That's longer than most empires last. For comparison, the Roman Empire lasted about 1,000 years. The Ottoman Empire, around 600. But Çatalhöyük maintained this apparently egalitarian structure for nearly a millennium and a half, without developing the hierarchical organization that we think of as natural to human societies. Step inside one of these houses, and you'd find yourself in a single rectangular room, maybe 4 by 6 meters. The entrance hole in the roof has a ladder leading down. Along one wall, there's a clay oven and hearth for cooking. Along another, raised platforms covered in red mats that served as beds and seating areas. Storage bins built into the walls hold grain, dried meat, tools. But then you start noticing the walls themselves. They're plastered smooth and painted, not just simple decorations either. Elaborate murals showing hunting scenes, geometric patterns, strange abstract designs that might be maps or might be something else entirely. Some walls show repeated applications of plaster, layer upon layer, suggesting the occupants replastered and repainted regularly, maybe annually, turning their homes into living canvases that evolved over decades. The most striking images feature bulls, massive, powerful aurochs, the wild ancestors of modern cattle, painted in red and black, sometimes shown being hunted, sometimes simply present, dominating the wall space. In some houses, actual bull skulls are mounted on the walls or set into pillars, the horns still attached, creating what archaeologists call bacrania. The effect would have been intimidating. Walking into a room and finding yourself face to face with the skull of an animal that stood 6 feet tall at the shoulder and weighed over a ton. But the bulls weren't the only animals represented. Leopards appear frequently, shown in reliefs or painted murals. Vultures too, huge birds with outstretched wings, and strange hybrid creatures, human figures with animal heads, or animal bodies with human features. This was a community deeply engaged with the animal world, finding meaning and perhaps power in these representations. Then there are the shrines, not separate buildings, but spaces within ordinary homes designated as sacred. Raised platforms with elaborate decorations, bull skulls arranged in patterns, clay figurines of animals and humans, including famous examples of corpulent female figures that archaeologists initially interpreted as mother goddesses, though current thinking is more cautious about assigning specific meanings. And beneath the floors, buried in shallow graves dug right into the packed earth, the ancestors. Çatalhöyük's inhabitants buried their dead beneath the sleeping platforms in their homes. You literally slept on top of your grandparents, your great-grandparents, generations of family members interred in the same space where you cooked, ate, and raised your children. This practice continued for centuries. Some houses have dozens of burials beneath their floors, creating what amounts to family crypts integrated directly into living space. The dead weren't separate from the living. They remained present, literally underfoot, part of the daily environment. You can imagine mothers telling children to behave, or they'd disturb great-grandfather sleeping beneath the platform. The dead as constant witnesses to the living. But why? Why this specific arrangement? Why no streets, no hierarchies, no separation between sacred and domestic space? Some researchers think Çatalhöyük represents an experiment in radical egalitarianism, a community that deliberately rejected hierarchical organization, maintaining social equality through shared hardship. The difficult rooftop access meant everyone experienced the same inconvenience. The uniform house sizes meant no one could claim status through superior housing. The integration of shrines into homes meant religious authority couldn't become centralized. Others suggest the layout was defensive. Most streets meant no easy way for attackers to penetrate the settlement. The blank exterior walls made the entire city into a fortress that didn't look like a fortress. The rooftop access meant defenders could move freely while invaders would be trapped in individual houses. Still others think it was about something deeper, something spiritual. Maybe the rooftop entry symbolized ascent to a higher realm, descending into homes like descending into the underworld. Maybe the bulls represented male power, the female figurines represented female fertility, and the houses themselves were spaces where these forces were kept in balance. Maybe the ancestors buried beneath floors were thought to bless the living, their presence ensuring prosperity and protection. What we do know is that this arrangement worked. For 1400 years, through climate changes, technological developments, and population growth, Çatalhöyük maintained its peculiar organization. 8,000 people living in deliberate intimacy, century after century, creating art, raising children, burying their dead, and somehow avoiding the centralized power structures that emerge in virtually every other ancient city. Then, around 6000 BC, something changed. The site was gradually abandoned, not destroyed by war or natural disaster, just slowly emptied as people moved away. By 5950 BC, Çatalhöyük was deserted. The rooftops collapsed, the walls crumbled, and wind-blown soil gradually buried the entire settlement. Why did they leave? We don't know. Maybe the local resources were exhausted. Maybe climate change made the area less productive. Maybe the social experiment finally failed, people deciding they wanted streets and privacy, and the ability to enter their homes without climbing ladders. Or maybe they simply succeeded. Maybe whatever they were trying to prove about how humans could live together had been demonstrated, and it was time to take those lessons elsewhere. What's left behind is evidence that challenges everything we think we know about the inevitable arc of human civilization. We assume cities create hierarchies. We assume religion requires temples. We assume the dead must be separate from the living. Çatalhöyük suggests all these assumptions might be wrong. That humans can organize ourselves in radically different ways. That for 1400 years, 8,000 people found a way to live without kings, without priests, without the usual structures of power. They built a honeycomb city without streets, and it worked. Picture a world 8,000 years ago. You're standing on what will one day be called the Dogger Bank, 40 meters underwater in the North Sea. But right now, you're standing on solid ground. Rolling hills stretch in every direction. Rivers meander through valleys thick with oak and hazel. Herds of red deer graze in meadows that haven't seen the sun in 8 millennia. This isn't some fantasy. This was real. Doggerland, a landmass roughly the size of modern Britain, connecting what we now call England to the Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark. For thousands of years, it wasn't just a bridge between islands. It was the heartland, the place where people actually lived while the colder territories to the north and south were seasonal hunting grounds. And then the sea swallowed it whole. We only know about Doggerland because of fishermen, not archaeologists with careful excavation techniques, not researchers with ground-penetrating radar. Fishermen dragging bottom trawlers across the North Sea bed, pulling up bones and tools along with their catch. A mammoth tooth here, a beautifully worked flint blade there. Occasionally something that makes archaeologists drop whatever they're doing and rush to the docks. Like the day in 1931, when a fishing boat working the Lemon and Oa banks pulled up a barbed antler point, dated to around 11,740 years ago. Still sharp enough to hunt with, still carrying traces of the hand that had shaped it. The artifacts keep coming, thousands of them now. Stone axes designed for woodworking, harpoon points for spearing fish, scrapers for processing hides, bone tools carved with geometric patterns, each one a message from a world that drowned so slowly that nobody realized they were living through an apocalypse. Because that's the thing about Doggerland. It didn't sink overnight. The flooding took millennia. Imagine you're living there 12,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age. The world is warming. The massive ice sheets covering Scandinavia are starting to melt, but you don't notice. Why would you? Sea level rises maybe a millimeter per year, perhaps a few centimeters in a bad decade. One human lifetime might see the shoreline retreat 20-30 meters. Noticeable if you're paying attention, but not catastrophic. Your ancestors had stories about islands that used to be visible on the horizon. Gone now. Your grandparents remembered when the river mouth was half a day's walk closer. Now it's a full day. The hunting is still good. The rivers still teem with salmon. The meadows still attract massive herds of aurochs and red deer. So you adapt. You move inland. You find new places to camp. Life continues. The archaeological evidence suggests Doggerland wasn't just inhabited, it was thriving. Core samples from the seabed show thick deposits of peat, evidence of extensive marshlands perfect for waterfowl hunting. Pollen analysis reveals diverse forests. Oak, elm, hazel, lime trees creating a temperate woodland rich with game. Geological surveys map out ancient river systems, some of them major waterways that would have served as natural highways for travel and trade. This was prime real estate. While the territories that became Britain and Scandinavia were still emerging from the Ice Age, cold and relatively barren, Doggerland was warm, fertile, and absolutely packed with resources. Population density here might have been higher than anywhere else in northern Europe. Settlements probably dotted every major river valley. Seasonal camps clustered along the coast. Trade networks connected communities across hundreds of miles. We'll never know for certain because the evidence is 40 meters underwater, buried under millennia of marine sediment. But every artifact that comes up suggests a sophisticated culture, people who understood seasonal migration patterns of game animals, who could navigate by rivers and coastlines, who had trade connections that brought amber from the Baltic and flint from sources in what's now England. Then came the catastrophe that nobody saw coming. Around 6,200 BCE, something happened off the coast of Norway. An underwater landslide of truly staggering proportions. 3,000 cubic kilometers of sediment, roughly the volume of Iceland, suddenly collapsed and slid into the Norwegian Sea. Geologists call it the Storegga Slide. The people living in Doggerland probably had another name for it. The end of the world. The landslide generated a mega tsunami. Not the kind of tsunami we're familiar with from modern disasters. This was something out of geological nightmares. Wave heights of 20 meters, possibly more, racing across the North Sea at hundreds of kilometers per hour. The water wouldn't have looked like a wave at first. Just the sea level suddenly rising and rising and rising, swallowing everything in its path. The lowland coast of Doggerland would have been hit within hours. Communities that had lived in the same river valleys for generations were wiped out in minutes. The tsunami probably reached as far inland as the low hills, turning them temporarily into islands. And when the water receded, it didn't recede completely. Because Doggerland was already sinking, the Storegga Slide didn't just create a tsunami. It accelerated the drowning that had been happening for thousands of years. Areas that had been marginally above sea level were suddenly submerged permanently. The great central landmass began breaking apart into islands. Within a few generations, maybe a century or two, what had been the heartland of northern Europe was gone, reduced to a few high points that would eventually become the Dogger Bank and other shallow areas of the modern North Sea. The survivors fled north to what became Scandinavia, west to Britain, which was now becoming an island itself, east to the European mainland. They carried their stories with them. Tales of a great flood that swallowed the world. Sound familiar? Flood myths appear in cultures all around the world. The biblical deluge, the Mesopotamian Gilgamesh epic, Greek legends of Deucalion, Aboriginal Australian stories of rising seas. Maybe some of them remember real events, real places that drowned when the Ice Age ended. Because Doggerland wasn't unique, it was just the largest and best documented of countless land masses that vanished beneath the waves when sea levels rose by 120 meters at the end of the last glaciation. Entire continents' worth of coastline disappeared, and coastlines are exactly where humans prefer to live. Off the coast of India, marine archaeologists have found structures in the Gulf of Combat that some researchers believe might be the legendary city of Dwarka, mentioned in ancient Sanskrit texts as being swallowed by the sea. Sonar imaging shows geometric patterns on the seafloor, straight lines that look suspiciously like walls. The structures, if that's what they are, would be over 9,000 years old. In the Black Sea, researchers have discovered what appears to be a submerged river valley with preserved wooden structures. Dating suggests they're at least 7,000 years old, drowned when the Mediterranean broke through the Bosphorus and flooded what had been a freshwater lake. The sudden flooding might have displaced hundreds of thousands of people, creating refugee waves that spread across Europe and the Middle East. Off the coast of Japan, the Yonaguni Monument puzzles archaeologists. Massive stone formations showing right angles and apparently carved steps. Natural geology, or evidence of a culture that thrived when sea levels were lower. The debate continues, but the site's very existence raises uncomfortable questions about how much we might have lost. Every major coastal area has them. Mysteries in shallow water. Anomalies that might be natural formations or might be something more. The problem is that underwater archaeology is expensive, technically challenging, and often impossible in areas with strong currents or poor visibility. We're blind to our own history, unable to see what lies just offshore. Consider the implications. At the peak of the last ice age, 20,000 years ago, sea levels were 120 meters lower than today. That's a 40-story building worth of difference. The global coastline was hundreds of kilometers farther out than it is now. Vast areas of continental shelf were dry land. The Indonesian islands were connected to mainland Asia. Australia was joined to New Guinea. The Persian Gulf was a river valley. The Mediterranean coastline extended far beyond its modern boundaries. And where do humans naturally settle? Near water, on coasts along rivers beside lakes. The most productive environments, the places with the most diverse resources, the easiest transportation networks. If there were sophisticated cultures developing during the tail end of the Ice Age, they would have been coastal. And when sea levels rose, they would have drowned. How many Göbekli Tepes are under 40 meters of water? How many Çatalhöyüks lie beneath the silt of submerged river deltas? How many innovations, how many cultural achievements, how many early experiments with settled life were erased completely when the seas rose? We don't know. We can't know. The water keeps its secrets. What we can say is this. The world map 8,000 years ago looked radically different from today. Entire regions where humans likely lived in significant numbers are now inaccessible beneath the waves. The story of early civilization that we've reconstructed from terrestrial sites might be just a fraction of the full picture. The high ground version. The settlements that survived because they happened to be far enough inland or high enough above sea level to escape the flood. The drowned cities remain silent, waiting in the deep water, holding answers to questions we haven't learned to ask yet. And the tide keeps rising, slowly, inexorably, just as it did when Doggerland sank beneath the waves. History doesn't repeat, but it echoes. And sometimes, late at night, if you listen carefully to the sound of water against the shore, you might hear those echoes carrying stories from the world that drowned. While Mesopotamia was getting all the credit as civilization's cradle, something remarkable was happening 1,500 miles to the east, something that wouldn't be discovered until the 1920s, something that would fundamentally challenge everything archaeologists thought they knew about the origins of urban life. In the Indus River Valley, stretching across what's now Pakistan and northwest India, a civilization had emerged that was sophisticated in ways that make ancient Sumer look almost primitive. We call it the Indus Valley Civilization, or the Harappan Civilization, after one of its major cities. And here's the thing that should blow your mind. At its peak around 2500 BCE, it was the largest of the three early civilizations, bigger than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. Over 1,500 settlements spanning an area of 1.25 million square kilometers. That's roughly the size of Western Europe, but size isn't what makes it extraordinary. What makes it extraordinary is how different it was from everything we thought we knew about how civilizations should work. Let's start with the cities themselves. Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, the two largest urban centers, weren't just big. They were planned, not organically grown over centuries with winding streets and chaotic layouts like most ancient cities. These were designed from the ground up with precision that wouldn't be matched again until the Roman Empire. Picture this. You're walking through Mohenjo-Daro in 2500 BCE. The streets are laid out in perfect grid patterns, intersecting at right angles. Main boulevards run north-south and east-west, wide enough for cart traffic. Smaller streets branch off in orderly fashion. Every building is constructed from standardized bricks, all in the exact same ratio, roughly 4:2:1. Not close to the same ratio. Exactly the same ratio, maintained across hundreds of sites over thousands of years. But here's where it gets really weird. Every house, from the largest mansion to the smallest worker's dwelling, has a private bathing area. Connected to what? A sophisticated drainage system running beneath the streets. Clay pipes and covered drains carrying wastewater away from residential areas. Manholes at regular intervals for maintenance and cleaning. We're talking about indoor plumbing and municipal sewage systems in the Bronze Age. While most of the world was throwing waste into the streets, the Harappans had figured out sanitation engineering that wouldn't be seen again for thousands of years. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro takes this obsession with water management to another level. A massive public bathing pool, 12 meters long and 7 meters wide, sealed with natural tar to prevent leaks, surrounded by private changing rooms. Water could be filled and drained through carefully engineered systems. Some archaeologists think it was for ritual purification. Others suggest it was just civic infrastructure, public hygiene on a monumental scale. Either way, it shows a level of central planning and civic organization that seems impossible for the time period. Someone was coordinating construction across entire cities. Someone was enforcing building codes and maintaining infrastructure. Someone was thinking about public health and urban planning in ways that wouldn't become common again until the modern era. But here's the mystery that has haunted archaeologists for a century. We don't know who that someone was. In Mesopotamia you find palaces, massive structures where kings lived and ruled. In Egypt you find temples and tombs celebrating god-kings who commanded absolute power. But in the Indus Valley, nothing. No palaces, no temples, no obvious seats of authority. The largest structures are warehouses and public baths. The most impressive architecture is devoted to commerce and sanitation, not power and worship. Some buildings are larger than others, suggesting wealth differences, but nothing like the massive inequality you see in other ancient civilizations. No royal tombs filled with treasure, no monuments to individual rulers, no weapons caches or fortifications suggesting military power. It's like the entire civilization operated on principles that don't fit any model we have for how ancient societies should work. Either they had a completely different kind of social organization, one so subtle it left no archaeological signature, or we're missing something fundamental about how to interpret the evidence. Then there's the writing, the Indus script. Over 4,000 inscriptions have been found, mostly on small seals used for trade and administration. Short sequences of symbols, usually just 5 to 7 characters, sometimes accompanied by images of animals, particularly a creature that might be a bull or unicorn. For 100 years, scholars have tried to decipher it. Hundreds of attempts, dozens of claimed breakthroughs, but no consensus. We don't even know what language it represents. Dravidian, Proto-Sanskrit, something else entirely that died out with the civilization. The script appears on pottery, tools, seals, even on a wooden signboard that somehow survived 4,500 years. This suggests it was used widely, integrated into daily life and commerce. But without a bilingual text, like the Rosetta Stone that unlocked Egyptian hieroglyphs, we're left guessing. And that means we can't read their own accounts of who they were or what they believed. Can't access their history, their literature, their religious texts if they had any. An entire civilization that achieved technological and urban sophistication rivaling anything else in the ancient world, and we can't hear their voice. Think about what might be written on those seals. Trade records, religious prayers, poetry, government decrees, personal names, all of it locked away behind symbols we can't decode. Some researchers think the script might not even be full writing. Maybe it's a proto-writing system, symbols representing ideas rather than language. Others argue the inscriptions are too short to represent complex language anyway, that maybe the Harappans simply didn't need or want extensive written records. But that seems unlikely for a civilization this sophisticated. More likely they wrote on perishable materials, palm leaves, cloth, wood that rotted away in the humid climate. What we have left are just the equivalent of business cards and shipping labels, the most durable remnants of a literary tradition that has otherwise vanished completely. Then around 1900 BCE, something happened. The cities began to empty. Not suddenly, not catastrophically, but gradually over several centuries. Construction quality declined. The rigid grid patterns broke down. The sophisticated drainage systems fell into disrepair. By 1300 BCE, the major urban centers were abandoned, and the civilization had fragmented into smaller, regional cultures. But why? There's no evidence of invasion or conquest, no burn layers suggesting warfare, no mass graves indicating plague or massacre. The cities just declined. The leading theory points to climate change and environmental shifts. The Indus region experienced significant drying around 2000 BCE. Monsoon patterns shifted, weakening the summer rains that agriculture depended on. Rivers began changing course, moving away from established settlements. The Gagga-Hakra River, which might be the legendary Sarasvati mentioned in ancient Indian texts, dried up almost entirely. As water became scarce and agriculture less reliable, the population couldn't support large urban centers anymore. People dispersed, moving to smaller settlements near remaining water sources. The civilization didn't collapse so much as dissolve, transforming from centralized urbanism back to village-based societies. But some archaeologists wonder if we're looking at the end of the story when we should be looking at the beginning. The mature phase of the Indus civilization that we see in Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro represents centuries of development. What came before? Were there earlier experiments in urbanism that failed, predecessor settlements that got washed away or buried? Recent excavations at sites like Barana and Rakigahi suggest the civilization's roots go back much further than we thought, possibly to 8000 BCE in its earliest phases. That would make it not just contemporary with Mesopotamia, but potentially older in its origins. And there might be dozens, maybe hundreds of sites still buried. The Indus floodplain has been building up silt for thousands of years. Early settlements could lie buried under meters of sediment, invisible to survey, waiting for someone to dig deep enough to find them. We might be seeing just the final flowering of a tradition that goes back millennia, the end point of an urban experiment that began when the rest of the world was still figuring out agriculture. A civilization that invented city planning, public sanitation, and standardized manufacturing, then vanished so completely that for 4,000 years nobody even knew it had existed. Picture Egypt before the pyramids, before the pharaohs with their gold and their monuments, before the hieroglyphs and the temples that line the Nile. Go back far enough and you find something nobody expected. A thriving, sophisticated culture that understood astronomy, tracked celestial cycles, and built monumental stone structures when the rest of the world was supposedly just figuring out basic agriculture. Around 7000 BC, roughly 9,000 years ago, a group of people gathered in what is now one of the most inhospitable places on Earth, the southern Egyptian Sahara. They arranged massive stone slabs in a circle, aligned with astronomical precision to mark the summer solstice. This was Nabta Playa, and it predates Stonehenge by at least 1,000 years, maybe two. But here's what makes Nabta Playa truly remarkable. These weren't just random stones. Archaeological surveys have revealed multiple stone circles, burial mounds, and what appear to be calendar devices tracking both solar and stellar movements. One arrangement seems designed to cite the rising of Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, the same star that would become central to Egyptian mythology thousands of years later, the star whose heliacal rising marked the beginning of the Nile flood, the star associated with Isis herself. Think about what this means. 9,000 years ago, in what's now barren desert, people were conducting systematic astronomical observations sophisticated enough to predict stellar positions. They were organizing themselves into groups large enough to move multi-ton stones. They were planning construction projects that required coordination across seasons, maybe years. This wasn't primitive survival. This was organized, knowledge-based society. And they were doing it in a place that makes no sense today. The area around Nabta Playa now receives maybe a few millimeters of rain per year. It's desert, proper desert, the kind that kills unprepared travelers in days. But when those stones were erected, the Sahara was green. Not just green, lush. Grasslands stretched for thousands of miles. Rivers and lakes dotted the landscape. Elephants, giraffes, and hippos roamed freely. This was the tail end of what geologists call the African humid period, a 10,000-year span when the Sahara bloomed. The people who built Nabta Playa were cattle herders, semi-nomadic groups who returned to the same sites seasonally, following the rains and the grass. But they weren't simple pastoralists. The evidence suggests they had developed complex social hierarchies. Some burial sites contain elaborate grave goods, others don't. Some stone arrangements required astronomical knowledge that takes generations to accumulate. You don't just wake up one morning and decide to track the precession of Sirius. You inherit that knowledge, refine it, pass it on. So where did this knowledge come from? And more importantly, where did it go? Around 5,500 BC, the African humid period ended, not gradually, but with shocking speed. Climate reconstructions show the Sahara dried out in less than 500 years, maybe less than 300. Grasslands turned to scrub, then to sand. Lakes evaporated. Rivers stopped flowing. The animals migrated or died. And the people, the astronomically sophisticated cattle herders who had lived there for millennia, they had to go somewhere. The mainstream theory says they migrated east, toward the Nile Valley. They brought their cattle, their astronomical knowledge, their social structures. They merged with existing Nile Valley populations and slowly, over thousands of years, developed into what we recognize as ancient Egyptian civilization. But some researchers think the connection runs deeper than that. They point to Hierakonpolis, one of the oldest settlements in Upper Egypt. By 4000 BC, Hierakonpolis was already a complex urban center with monumental architecture, organized religion, and social stratification. The people there were brewing beer at industrial scales, creating sophisticated pottery, and most intriguingly, they were keeping exotic animals in what appears to be some kind of menagerie or zoo. Elephants, hippos, baboons, even crocodiles, all in captivity. That requires infrastructure. It requires surplus food production to feed animals that aren't working for you. It requires an organized society wealthy enough to devote resources to something that serves no immediate practical purpose. This wasn't a struggling farming village. This was an established civilization with centuries, maybe millennia, of development behind it. The traditional chronology says Egyptian civilization crystallized rapidly around 3100 BC, when Upper and Lower Egypt unified under the first pharaoh. But Hierakonpolis and sites like it suggest the unification wasn't the beginning of Egyptian civilization. It was the culmination of a process that had been underway for thousands of years, possibly stretching back to those cattle herders at Nabta Playa. And then there's the Sphinx. That monument has caused more controversy than almost any other structure in Egypt. The standard archaeological dating puts its construction around 2500 BC, during the reign of Pharaoh Khafre. The face is supposedly his, though it looks nothing like other depictions of him. The body is a lion, the largest monolithic sculpture in the ancient world, carved directly out of the limestone bedrock. But in the 1990s, geologist Robert Schoch proposed something radical. He examined the erosion patterns on the Sphinx enclosure and found something unexpected. Deep vertical weathering, the kind caused by heavy rainfall running down stone surfaces. Not the horizontal wind erosion you'd expect in a desert environment. In Egypt's climate for the past 5,000 years, that kind of rain erosion shouldn't exist. Schoch argued the Sphinx had to be much older than the conventional dating, old enough to have experienced the heavy rains that fell in Egypt at the end of the African humid period. That would push its construction back to at least 7,000 BC, maybe earlier. Thousands of years before the pharaohs. Thousands of years before Egypt was supposed to have the organizational capacity to carve a monument that size. The mainstream archaeological community mostly rejects this theory. They point out that no other artifacts from that period show similar sophistication. No pottery, no tools, no settlement remains that would indicate the presence of a civilization capable of such engineering. The erosion, they argue, could be explained by other factors. Underground water seepage, chemical weathering, the fact that the Sphinx was buried in sand for much of its history, protecting it from the wind erosion that affected other structures. But the debate won't die, because there's something else in the Egyptian historical record that keeps nagging at researchers. The Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus. Ancient Egyptian king lists don't start with human pharaohs. They start with the gods who supposedly ruled Egypt in a golden age before recorded history. After the gods came the Shemsu Hor, divine or semi-divine beings who maintained the ancient wisdom until the time of the first human kings. Egyptian priests took this chronology seriously. Manetho, writing in the 3rd century BC, included these pre-dynastic rulers in his history, crediting them with reigns lasting thousands of years. Now, nobody thinks these were literal immortal god-kings. But something is being remembered here. Some tradition of an earlier time, an earlier order, something that predated the pharaohs and provided the foundation for everything that came after. Was it just mythology? Or was it a garbled memory of those Saharan cultures, the cattle herders and astronomers who brought their knowledge to the Nile when their homeland turned to dust? Consider the evidence. Sophisticated astronomical knowledge appearing fully formed in early dynastic Egypt, complex social hierarchies with no apparent developmental period, monumental architecture built with precision that supposedly primitive farmers had no business achieving. And everywhere, this insistent tradition of an earlier age, a time before the pharaohs when wisdom flowed more freely. Maybe the story we tell about Egypt is wrong, not completely wrong, but incomplete. Maybe Egyptian civilization didn't spring up along the Nile from scratch. Maybe it was a refugee culture, founded by survivors from the dying Sahara who brought with them thousands of years of accumulated knowledge. They brought their astronomy and their cattle. They brought their social structures and their gods. They brought the memory of stone circles in green grasslands, of a time when the desert bloomed, and when they reached the Nile, they built something that would last forever. Not because they were primitive people suddenly struck by divine inspiration, but because they were sophisticated people carrying the torch from an older world, one that had vanished beneath the sand. The story of forgotten cities doesn't just belong to the old world. It's written into the soil of the Americas too, in places that for a long time almost nobody thought to look. For most of the 20th century, the narrative went like this. True civilization started in Mesopotamia, Egypt, maybe China, and the Americas came much later. Small bands of hunter-gatherers crossed the Bering Land Bridge, slowly trickled south, and only after a very long time did anything like cities appear. By the time you get pyramids in Mexico or great stone walls in the Andes, Sumer and Egypt had a head start of thousands of years. But the ground has been quietly disproving that story. Lie back and imagine a desert valley on the Peruvian coast, 5,000 years ago. No jungle here, no towering Andes right overhead. Just a broad, dry river plain opening toward the Pacific, wind humming over pale sand, the sky a vast white dome by day, and an ocean of stars by night. In the middle of this seemingly empty landscape, something impossible is rising. Stone platforms, wide plazas, staircases climbing toward the sky. You are looking at Caral Soup. Caral is old enough that if you could stand on one of its pyramids at sunset and somehow look halfway around the world, you would be watching the first stones going up at Egypt's pyramids. Same planet, same millennium, different experiment in what humans can do together. From a distance, Caral doesn't look like the sharp geometric monuments of later empires. The pyramids are low, stepped mounds, weathered and rounded by 5,000 years of wind. They seem almost like natural hills, until you walk closer and see the straight lines, the cut stone, the geometry that nature doesn't draw by itself. Picture yourself climbing one of those broad staircases. The steps are shallow and even, inviting. Up here, the valley opens in every direction, dry hills, the silver ribbon of the Soup River, and scattered clusters of other mounds and platforms. Caral isn't just one monument. It's a whole urban complex, a cluster of pyramids, residential areas, and ceremonial spaces strung out along a fertile strip of land. At the heart of it all, there's something strange and beautiful, a sunken circular plaza, like an amphitheater dug into the earth. Stand down there in your mind. Look up at the ring of the horizon framed by stone. Imagine hundreds of people gathered around you, their voices rising and falling, carrying around the circle, flutes made of condor and pelican bone, drums ringing like distant thunder, firelight flickering on stone. We don't know exactly what they did in that plaza. Ritual, performance, meetings of leaders, all of the above. But we do know this. Caral was organized. Someone, or some group, could coordinate labor on a massive scale, build pyramids, plan plazas, lay out residential districts. And yet for all this complexity, there's something missing from Caral that you might expect in an early city: weapons. Archaeologists have combed through its layers and found very little evidence of warfare. No defensive walls hemming in the city, no smashed skeletons with embedded spear points, no burned destruction layers screaming of conquest. Instead, the clues point to something else driving Caral's rise: trade and ritual. Caral sat near the coast, close enough for people to bring fish and shellfish from the Pacific. Cotton grew well in the irrigated fields of the valley. Cotton meant fishing nets. Fishing nets meant more fish than any one village needed. And surplus meant trade. Imagine caravans moving up and down the coast and inland into the highlands. People carrying fish, dried and salted. People bringing back exotic stones, pigments, gourds and herbs from faraway places. The city as a giant ritual and exchange hub. A place where people came not just to do business, but to participate in shared ceremonies that stitched different communities into one cultural fabric. Some researchers think Caral might have been part of a broader religious network along the Andean coast, a system of pilgrimage sites and ritual centers. If that's true, this was a civilization held together more by shared stories and shared festivals than by armies and walls. For a long time, nobody outside the valley knew it existed. The ruins were just lumpy hills in a quiet desert, mistaken for natural formations. Only in the late 20th century did excavations start to reveal how old it really was. And when the radiocarbon dates came back, 2600 BCE, 2700 BCE, archaeologists had to stop and recalibrate. While Egypt was building pyramids in stone, the people of Caral were building their own monumental platforms in adobe and rock, running irrigation canals, gathering in plazas, developing a complex society without the old world ever whispering in their ear. Civilization, it seemed, was not a single spark that spread outward from one holy cradle. Something humans invented more than once. Now tilt your mind to another landscape, another continent, another forgotten experiment. This time, you're in what will one day be called Louisiana. The air is heavy and wet. Cypress trees rise from dark water. In the summer, the heat sits on your shoulders like an extra blanket. It's 5,400 years ago, before the pyramids of Giza, before Stonehenge. Out here, according to the old story, there should only be small, mobile bands of hunter-gatherers, following game and seasonal plants, leaving almost nothing behind. But on a low terrace above a slow river, something else is appearing. Mounds. Not one or two, but 11 of them, linked by earthworks and arranged in an oval nearly a kilometre across. This place is called Watson Brake. From above, it looks eerily deliberate. 11 earthen mounds rising from a shallow ring of embankment, like beads on a necklace. Some are low, barely 3 meters high. Others are taller. None of them reach the vast scale of later Mississippian mounds, but the pattern is unmistakable. People here, 6,000 years ago, were reshaping the land in a long-term coordinated project. And here is the part that breaks expectations. The people who built Watson Brake were still hunters and foragers. No clear evidence of intensive farming. No cities in the old world sense. Yet they were already organizing to move hundreds of thousands of baskets of earth, year after year, generation after generation. To build something like Watson Brake, you need more than muscle. You need planning. You need shared purpose. You need some way of convincing people that it's worth returning to the same place again and again, to add a little more earth, a little more shape, to a structure that will outlive them. Archaeologists once thought the nearby site of Poverty Point, built roughly 3,000 years ago, was the oldest large mound complex in North America. Watson Brake pushed that timeline back by another 2,000 years. Suddenly, the idea that complex societies in North America are recent became impossible to defend. This wasn't an exception either. As radiocarbon dates began to accumulate, an older pattern started to appear. Mound building in the eastern woodlands is ancient, deep, and surprisingly widespread. Watson Brake is simply one of the clearest early examples, a quiet monument to a way of life that doesn't fit neatly into our categories of hunter-gatherer or farmer, simple or complex. Now, place Caral and Watson Brake side by side in your mind. On one side, a desert city of pyramids, plazas, and ritual plazas tied to irrigation and coastal trade. On the other, a ring of earthen mounds in a humid forest world, built by people who still lived from wild rivers and woods. Different continents, different ecologies, different toolkits. But beneath the differences, the same human impulse. To gather, to build, to mark a place on the earth as special, and to invest that place with meaning that survives the builders. These sites force us to reconsider the timeline we grew up with. There wasn't a long delay, with real civilization flowering only in the old world and slowly dripping west. Instead, as soon as conditions allowed, enough people, enough surplus, enough stories. Humans in both hemispheres began experimenting with large-scale organization, and the more we look, the more it seems we've only been seeing the tip of the iceberg. Far to the east of Caral, beyond the high Andes, the Amazon basin stretches like a green ocean. For a long time, people thought of it as pristine wilderness, barely touched by humans until recent centuries. A place too poor in soil to support large, complex societies. But satellites don't believe that story. In the last few decades, LiDAR, laser scanning from the air, has started to peel back the canopy. Underneath the jungle's green skin, geometric shapes are appearing. Squares, circles, straight lines, earthworks linked in patterns visible only from above, roads or causeways stretching for kilometers, connecting mound clusters and plaza-like clearings. Some of these geometries are subtle, the edges blurred by centuries of erosion and regrowth. Others are shockingly crisp. On the ground, archaeologists are finding signs of ancient soil improvement. Terra preta, dark, fertile earth created by people through careful management of charcoal, organic waste, and nutrients. It looks less like untouched wilderness, and more like a long-abandoned garden, swallowed back by forest. How old are these Amazonian earthworks? Some are relatively recent in archaeological terms. Others may go back 2,000 or 3,000 years. A few hints suggest there could be even older foundations still buried beneath later deposits, waiting for more precise dating. And the Amazon is only one region. Similar patterns are emerging from the Bolivian Llanos de Moxos, from the Orinoco Basin, from stretches of Central America where dense forest has hidden human fingerprints for millennia. Every year, remote sensing reveals more straight lines that nature almost never draws on its own. If we step back and soften our eyes, a new picture comes into view. Instead of a single center of innovation with everyone else playing catch-up, we see multiple centers, independent flowerings of complexity: coastal Peru, the lower Mississippi Valley, the Amazon, Mesoamerica. Each one responding to its own climate, its own plants and animals, its own histories of migration and memory. In some places, people chose stone; in others, earth. In others, the architecture was made of wood and fiber that rarely survives. In some cultures, hierarchy hardened into kings and empires. In others, power stayed diffuse, shared among ritual specialists, elders or councils that left no colossal statues of themselves behind. The pattern isn't a straight ladder from simple to advanced. It's more like a forest, with different branches growing, withering, and sprouting again. Caral, Watson Brake, the earthworks hidden beneath Amazonian trees. They all whisper the same unsettling, comforting thought. Our species has been capable of complex, large-scale cooperation for a very long time. Long before writing in Mesopotamia, long before marble temples in Greece, long before the stories you memorized in school. Civilization was not a once-in-history accident. It was an option our ancestors discovered again and again, in different soils, under different skies. Some of their cities were made of stone and lasted. Others were made of earth, wood, and ritual, and melted back into the landscape when their time was done. Many we have not yet found. Many more we will never recognize, because the jungle and the river and the wind have done their patient work. As you drift deeper into the story, let that idea settle. Wherever there were humans with enough time, enough surplus, and enough imagination, there were probably experiments in living together at scale. Some became empires. Some stayed as seasonal gathering places, stitched together across vast distances by trade, kinship, and shared ceremonies. And all of them, known and unknown, were part of the same quiet revolution, the shift from scattered bands to networks, from networks to centers, from centers to cities. In one desert valley, they called that experiment Caral. On a river terrace in ancient Louisiana, they raised Watson Brake. Somewhere under the dark canopy of the Amazon, the ghosts of other experiments are still waiting for us to notice the geometry beneath the leaves. The Americas were never just a blank stage, waiting for the old world to arrive. They were writing their own chapters of the human story, in parallel, in earth and stone. And as we uncover those chapters, one scan, one excavation at a time, the old question returns, a little louder each time. If we've already missed cities this big, this old, what else have we forgotten? By the time our species was weaving story and memory into language, some humans had started weaving stone into patterns. Not rough shelters, not just fire rings or crude boundary markers. Vast arrangements of rock that seem to speak a language we no longer understand. Long before cuneiform tablets in Sumer, before pharaohs carved their names into limestone, people across the world were dragging multi-ton blocks, carving subterranean cathedrals, and aligning stones with the movements of the sun and stars. They left us no books, no written explanations. Just the stones themselves, like paused sentences in a conversation that stopped thousands of years ago. You can picture it, night, a sky black enough that the Milky Way burns like a river. No light pollution, no city glow, just firelight, breath, and stone. Somewhere in that darkness, humans are lifting, hauling, chanting. They're building something that will still be standing when their names, their languages, their entire peoples are gone. We call them megaliths, big stones, a boring word for something that, to the people who built them, must have felt like touching eternity. And what's strange is not just that these things exist, It's that they exist almost everywhere, from the wind-blasted coasts of Brittany to the tiny islands of Malta, from the forests of Japan to the foggy plains of Britain and the Levant. You find the same basic idea. Take rock, the most permanent material most humans will ever touch, and shape it into meaning. No empire commands this. There's no global king of stones. These projects rise in scattered pockets, separated by oceans and thousands of miles. But they all whisper the same unsettling suggestion, that deep in the Stone Age, humans were already thinking on a civilizational timescale. Let's start on an unlikely stage, a small limestone island in the center of the Mediterranean, Malta. Today, Malta is a dot on the map between Sicily and North Africa. But 6,000, 7,000 years ago, when most of the world's people were still living in small farming communities, someone here started building in stone on a scale that should not exist for such an early date. Places like Hagarkim, Menajedra, Tarxian, temple complexes with massive upright slabs and curved, organic layouts. And then there is something even stranger, hidden below a normal Maltese street, beneath houses and traffic, and the everyday noise of modern life, the Hull Safliani Hypogeum. From the outside, it looks like nothing. But descend the stairs, and you enter a world carved entirely out of living rock. Multiple levels, chambers flowing into chambers, ceilings shaped to imitate surface temples. A whole underworld architecture, built by people who had no metal tools, no wheels, no written language. Archaeologists generally date the Hypogeum and Malta's megalithic temples to around 3,600, 2,500 BCE, with some structures possibly beginning even earlier. That puts them older than the pyramids of Giza, older than Stonehenge, older than almost anything you could name as ancient. Inside the Hypogeum, you find tiny carved spirals, bull horns, the faint red traces of painted walls. There are rooms where a whisper from one wall carries unnaturally clear to another, a kind of Stone Age sound engineering. In the so-called oracle room, certain frequencies resonate and vibrate through bone and chest, turning a human voice into something bigger, something other. No one wrote down what these people believed. We only see the shadows, the bones of hundreds, maybe thousands of individuals placed carefully over time. Figurines of reclining figures, labyrinthine passages that feel less like a tomb and more like a memory palace for a culture we no longer remember. Then, suddenly, it stops. Around 2500 BCE, Malta's temple culture collapses. The building ends. The Hypogeum is sealed. New people arrive with different styles of pottery, different burial customs. The old ways vanish so completely that even Maltese folklore barely remembers them. A megalithic tradition flashes into existence, lasts 1,000 years or so, and then is swallowed by silence. If we move north and west, to the Atlantic coast of France, another silence waits under slate-grey skies. Carnac, stretching across the fields near this small Breton town, are more than 3,000 standing stones. Not in a circle, but in long, rippling rows, like waves of rock frozen mid-motion. Some weigh tens of tons. Others are smaller, but all have been placed, one, by human hands. The alignments at Carnac go on for almost 4 kilometers. To walk them is to understand that this was not a weekend project. This was generation after generation committing to a plan that none of them would see finished. Dates are debated, but many of the stones seem to have been raised between 4,500 and 3,300 BCE. Again, older than most of the monuments people think of when they hear the word ancient. What were they for? No inscription tells us, but when researchers model the positions of the stones against the prehistoric sky, patterns start to appear. Some rows seem to align with solstice sunrise points, others with lunar standstills. Those rare moments in the moon's 18.6-year cycle when it rises or sets at its most extreme positions on the horizon. In other words, whoever laid out Carnac was not just stacking rocks at random, they were watching the sky. Tracking cycles so long you'd have to pass the knowledge down across generations to stay accurate. This isn't simple stargazing. This is systematized observation, proto-astronomy. And yet, we have no temples of marble, mo written ephemerides, mo mythological texts from these people. Just the stones, and the faint echo of a calendar written in granite and quartz. We see similar things elsewhere. Passages in Irish tombs like Newgrange that light up perfectly when the midwinter sun slices in through a stone corridor. Stone circles in Britain that mirror the rising and setting points of key stars. Again and again, the same idea. Fix the sky into the earth so the heavens can be read in stone. But this wasn't only a European obsession. If we travel instead across Asia to a land of forests and volcanic mountains, we find another culture playing a very long game with time. Japan. The Jomon. For most of recent history, Japan is associated with rice farming, samurai, written records. But before all that, for thousands of years, there were the Jomon peoples, hunter-gatherers who refused to fit the simple textbook image of primitive. From about 14,000 BCE onward, Jomon communities built permanent settlements, made some of the world's earliest pottery, and developed elaborate ritual objects. They weren't just wandering bands chasing deer. They were rooted in place, managing forests, exploiting coastal resources, and gradually building up something that looks suspiciously like early urban life. At sites like Sanimarayama in northern Honshu, you find deep storage pits, large communal buildings, evidence of long-distance trade in obsidian and jade. Wooden posts mark out large structures that may have been watchtowers or ceremonial platforms. And scattered across Japan are stone circles and alignments from the later Jomon period, roughly 2000, 1000 BCE. Places like the Oyu stone circles in Akita, concentric rings of river stones with standing stones and arranged features that some researchers think align with solar events. We can't be sure, but patterns in the layout suggest at least some awareness of the sun's path and seasonal markers. The Jomon lived in this semi-settled, complex hunter-gatherer mode for nearly 10,000 years. Imagine that. A culture sustaining itself in one region longer than the entire span from the pyramids to now, leaving behind not empires, but a quiet accumulation of craft, ritual, and architecture in wood and stone. They didn't conquer continents. They didn't carve their laws into basalt stelae, but they built in ways that required planning, coordination, and a sense of time that goes far beyond next year's harvest. And all the while, on other coasts, other islands, other river mouths, different peoples were lifting stones, aligning them, burying their dead beneath them. Standing stones in Korea, dolmens in Manchuria, menhirs in Iberia and the Sahara, massive stone terraces and platforms along the Pacific coasts. The pattern is almost too big to see. A global tendency toward monumental stone building, rising independently before writing, before kingdoms, before the stories we usually tell. This raises a question that's hard to shake, especially when you're lying in the dark, listening. Were these builders completely isolated? Or did information move farther and faster than we usually imagine for the Stone Age? Some researchers have proposed that early maritime networks may have carried ideas, and sometimes people, along coasts and between islands long before historical seafaring civilizations. The logic is simple. Coasts are rich in resources. Boats are an obvious solution if you live near water. And humans have been making watercraft for tens of thousands of years. We had reached Australia by at least 50,000 years ago. That implies boats, navigation, and the ability to manage open water crossings long before the first city walls rose in Mesopotamia. In the Mediterranean, it's easy to imagine short hops between islands spreading not just pots and seeds, but concepts, ways of marking sacred space, ways of honoring the dead, larger-scale architectural ideas that might drift from shore to shore like pollen, along the Atlantic facade, from Portugal up through Brittany to the British Isles. Some scholars see common threads in megalithic tomb design, stone carving motifs, and burial customs. These could have spread along a loose maritime highway, generations of coastal sailors hugging the shore, resting in coves, exchanging goods and stories. Even in the Pacific, long before the great Polynesian expansions, there may have been earlier waves of seafaring that stitched together parts of East Asia and islands Southeast Asia, seeding shared traditions of ancestor veneration, sky watching, and, sometimes, stone building. To be clear, there's no solid evidence of a single lost global civilization orchestrating all of this. No Atlantean master plan. The genetics, the archaeology, the timelines all point instead to many independent cultures, each rooted in its own landscape and history. But the idea of lost networks, regional, maritime, coastal, small communities in canoes and simple boats, carrying not just food and raw materials but ideas about the sacred and the permanent, that's harder to rule out. What these stones really show us is not aliens or forgotten super technologies, but something in some ways even more impressive: the raw capacity of human societies we usually underestimate. People with no writing, no metal, no beasts of burden, organizing hundreds of individuals to move multi-ton blocks over many kilometers. People without city bureaucracy or stock markets coordinating long-term building projects that outlast their own lives. People whose knowledge of the sky is embodied not in parchment, but in sightlines carved into hilltops, in corridors that catch a single beam of sunlight on one morning each year. They remind us that complexity doesn't always look like skyscrapers and silicon chips. Sometimes it looks like a field of stones that still stands straight after 6,000 winters. Sometimes it looks like an underground chamber where your voice turns into thunder. Sometimes it's a ring of river rocks in a German village, where people gathered to watch the sun slide toward the horizon line they'd been tracking for generations. These monuments are not just relics, they're evidence. Proof that long before the first cities we learn about in school, humans were already thinking in centuries, already weaving knowledge into landscapes, already reaching for something that would endure. They are the stone pages of a book almost entirely missing, the few lines that survived the fires, lying out in the open. And as we move forward in our story, from these scattered whispers in stone to the more familiar ruins of vanished cities, it's worth carrying that thought with us. By the time anyone wrote history, we had already been forgetting it for a very, very long time. Picture the world right after the last ice age is starting to loosen its grip. Great walls of ice are melting back. Rivers are roaring with glacial melt. Coastlines are not fixed lines on a map, but moving targets, creeping inland year by year. To your ancestors, the world itself seemed unstable, as if the ground could not quite decide where it wanted to be. Then, suddenly, it changed its mind again. Around 12,800 years ago, just as things were warming and stabilizing, the climate snapped back into something like an ice age. We call it the Younger Dryas. For the people living through it, it would have felt like a cosmic betrayal. Winters getting longer and harsher, summers turning shorter, colder, less predictable. Animal herds shifting their routes or vanishing entirely. Plants your grandparents had relied on simply failing to appear. No one knows exactly what caused it. Some researchers point to changes in ocean circulation as meltwater flooded the North Atlantic, disrupting the great conveyor belts of heat. Others argue for a comet or meteor impact, a fragmenting body exploding over the ice, throwing dust and water vapor into the atmosphere. The evidence is debated. What isn't debated is that the world, which had been slowly thawing, suddenly lurched back toward the cold. Now imagine you're part of a small village on a pleasant riverbank in the Near East. For generations, the climate has been improving. Summers are warm, rainfall somewhat predictable. People have begun to experiment. Tiny protofields scratched into the soil. Wild grains harvested and maybe, just maybe, nudged along. Early dogs curling up by the fires. A few rough stone walls to keep out wind and curious animals. It wouldn't look like a city to us, more like a permanent camp that doesn't quite know it's permanent yet. But for your people, staying in one place most of the year is a radical experiment, a new way of being human. Then the cold comes back, game grows scarce, wild stands of grain fail. The plants you've learned to count on ripen late, or not at all. Rivers that usually flood gently now freeze, then flood violently when the thaw comes all at once. Your early experiments in stability are punished. Settled life, which had seemed like the future, suddenly looks like a trap. Some groups abandon their villages and go back to a more mobile life. Others cling stubbornly to place, trying to coax food from a stingy land. Many simply vanish, not in some cinematic, mysterious way, but in the dull, grinding attrition of hunger and disease. The people die, or they scatter, or both. Archaeologists see this in the record as what they call abandonment horizons. Layers where it looks like people were there, and then they weren't. Tools stop appearing. Hearths go cold. Structures collapse and are never repaired. But we need to remember something crucial. A vanished site does not mean a vanished people. Often it just means the climate moved the goalposts, and your ancestors were forced to follow. As the Younger Dryas dragged on for over 1,000 years, it reshaped human history by reward and punishment. In some places, the harshness seems to have pushed people toward more intense cooperation, more careful cultivation of wild plants, more organized storage of food. In others, it broke experiments in settled life before they had time to solidify into anything like a city. When the Younger Dryas finally ended, the world didn't reset to normal. It shifted into the relatively mild, stable climate we enjoy today. Sea levels began to surge as ice sheets disintegrated. Coastlines drowned slowly but relentlessly. And with them, any early villages built in the wrong place. Think about how we build today. We love coasts. We crowd river deltas, harbors, estuaries. The same was likely true for early farmers and foragers. Rich soils, abundant fish, easy transport by boat. Perfect places to settle. Also perfect places to disappear when the seas rise 120 meters over several thousand years. Doggerland, the lost plain between Britain and mainland Europe, is just one example we happen to know about because we drag fishing nets and seismic equipment across it. Once it was a broad landscape of rivers, swamps, and rolling hills, a place where reindeer and later red deer wandered, where people built camps and maybe more. Now, it's silt and saltwater and shipping lanes. Multiply that by every continental shelf around the world. The Black Sea basin before it flooded. The Persian Gulf when it was a vast, fertile valley. The Sunda Shelf in Southeast Asia, where islands were once connected by low-lying plains. If early experiments in settled life took root in these places, most of their traces are now under dozens of meters of water. You don't need a global flood myth to erase a city. All you need is a coastline, a few thousand years, and a steady melt of ice. Inland, the story isn't much kinder. As climate zones shifted, grasslands turned to desert. Forests shrank or moved. Rivers changed course. A fertile valley could become a dust bowl in a few generations. Mud brick walls, wooden houses, red roofs. None of these are built to endure millennia without constant care. Once people move away, nature unbuilds their work. Winds level mounds. Floods wash away foundations. Plants pre-apart stone. From a human perspective, a city feels eternal. From a geological perspective, it's a temporary pattern in dust. But physical structures are only half the story. The other half is knowledge, stories, names. Imagine a small, flourishing town 10,000 years ago, maybe not quite as complex as Çatalhöyük, not as monumental as Göbekli Tepe, but something in between. A cluster of houses, storage pits, shrines, people trading obsidian blades and shell ornaments. They have stories about their founding ancestors, about the time before houses, about the age when people followed the herds. Now imagine 2 bad harvests in a row, a flood that ruins the stored grain, a disease that kills half the elders. Families argue about whether to stay or go. Some leave, some die. The survivors regroup upriver or across the hills in a new place with new neighbors. They bring their skills. They remember how to shape a stone, how to plant a seed. But the memory of the old town itself, that's more fragile. Human memory, even when trained, usually stretches accurately across perhaps 3 or 4 generations. Great-grandparents are already legends. Go back 7 or 8 generations, and you are in the hazy zone where history and myth start to braid together. A city destroyed when your ancestor's ancestor was a child becomes the old place the gods took back. Give it a few more centuries, and it's just the time before. Oral traditions are powerful, but they're not permanent. Stories are retold, simplified, reshaped to match new realities. Floods become punishments. Famines become moral lessons. Foreign traders become giants or spirits. or enemies sent by distant gods. The practical details. How walls were built, how fields were irrigated, how roads were laid out. Fade first. What survives is emotion, pride, fear, awe. From the outside, thousands of years later, we look at a featureless field or a calm stretch of sea and see nothing. Underneath, there might be a vanished village, a forgotten temple, an entire small civilization whose descendants still walk the earth with no clear idea where they came from. And that's the unsettling part. We are not just talking about ancient people. We are probably talking about your own lineage. Your ancestors may have founded cities that no one alive today remembers, not even as legend. When we talk about lost civilizations, it's tempting to imagine something exotic and separate, mysterious people with strange powers who disappeared. But the real story might be much more intimate and much more ordinary. Small communities building something remarkable, then losing it to bad luck, bad weather, or bad timing. Their descendants carrying forward fragments, tools, words, farming techniques, gods, without the stories that once tied them together. Civilization is more fragile than it looks. Our cities feel solid. Our data feels permanent. Yet we know how quickly knowledge can vanish. A library burns, a server farm floods, a language loses its last speakers, and whole ways of thinking disappear. Even now, in a world of satellites and backups, we worry about how much of our digital memory will survive a few hundred years, let alone 1,000. Now scale that anxiety back into prehistory. No stone books, no hard drives, just stories and bones and walls of mud and stone. Archaeology is our attempt to read those bones and walls, to coax memories out of dirt. It moves slowly, carefully, because the evidence is scattered and delicate. A few post holes here, a scatter of charred seeds there, a pile of animal bones with cut marks. From these scraps, patterns emerge. We see that settled life began earlier than we once thought. That monumental architecture can appear before permanent villages. That trade network stretched over astonishing distances long before writing. We see that the people who built Göbekli Tepe, who laid out the dense blocks of Çatalhöyük, who patterned the streets of Harappa, were not abrupt miracles. They were heirs to long, mostly invisible traditions. Every year, a new clue surfaces. In a road cut, in a construction trench, on the seafloor, in sonar images that show suspiciously straight lines where there should only be sand. LiDAR scans strip away forest canopies and reveal buried cities in the Amazon, in Central America, in Southeast Asia. Places that were once dismissed as pristine wilderness turn out to be rewilded gardens, the ghosts of old urban landscapes. And still, this is just what we've stumbled across while looking mostly on land, in politically stable regions, with the limited budgets and time that archaeology can afford. The majority of Earth's surface remains unexamined in any serious way. The continental shelves, where early coasts once lay, are largely unexplored archaeologically. Vast deserts hide sites under meters of blowing sand. Peat bogs, jungle soils, and floodplains quietly digest wood and bone. What's down there? How many times did humans, or near humans, push towards something like a city, build it, inhabit it for a few centuries, then watch it dissolve back into the landscape? How many Doggerlands and drowned valleys hold traces of people whose names no longer exist in any language? We don't know. We may never know fully. But each new discovery, each buried street grid under jungle canopy, each underwater stone structure that looks suspiciously deliberate, reminds us that the history we see is only the surviving tip of a much larger story. A story constantly edited by climate, catastrophe, and forgetting. Somewhere beneath the waves, beneath layers of silt and coral, there may be the foundations of a village older than any we've yet found, its fires long cold, its people long gone, its memory dissolved into nothing more than a faint, persistent human intuition that we have been here, building and rebuilding, for far longer than our textbooks like to admit. And as you drift deeper into the past and deeper into sleep, you can imagine the quiet of those lost streets. No footsteps, no voices, just stone and silt and water, waiting for the day when a diver's light or a sonar scan or a curious archaeologist's trowel will brush away a little of the forgetting, and let those forgotten cities speak again, if only in whispers. So now, lying here in the dark, let's pull all of these places back into view at once. Göbekli Tepe rising out of the Anatolian hills like a forgotten dream of stone. Çatalhöyük, a honeycomb of homes without streets, people walking across each other's rooftops. Doggerland, a drowned landscape where rivers once flowed between what are now separate islands. The gridded wells and silent drains of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, the shadowy precursors of Egypt, building monuments before anyone had ever heard the word pharaoh. Caral and Watson Brake in the Americas, cities and ceremonial centers emerging with almost no fanfare in our history books. And the stone rings and alignments scattered across the world, from Brittany to the Andes, whispering through time. What do all these places actually tell us? They tell us, first of all, that the story most of us learned about civilization is wrong in a very simple way. You probably know the script. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans are supposed to be wandering around in tiny bands, barely scraping by. Then suddenly, about 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, in Mesopotamia, something magical happens. Farming appears. Cities appear. Writing appears. Civilization turns on like a light switch. But these ruins, these drowned plains and half-buried temples, say something different. They suggest that the light was flickering on and off for a very long time. Not in one place, not in one culture, but in many, separated by oceans, deserts, and thousands of years. The old model says, first simple, then complex. First small villages, then towns, then cities, then empires. A staircase, neat and tidy, step by step, forever climbing. But Göbekli Tepe is older than agriculture in that region, and yet it's monumental. People who, as far as we can tell, had no cities and maybe no permanent villages, still coordinated labor, planned architecture, carved pillars weighing tons, and filled them with symbols. Çatalhöyük has dense, almost urban population levels, but no palace, no temple towering over the houses, no clear hierarchy. Everyone's roof is everyone else's street. No king, no pyramid, no written law code baked in clay. The Indus cities built some of the most advanced sewer systems in the ancient world, and yet we have no clear royal tombs, no epic inscriptions of conquest and divine kingship. In the Americas, Caral stands with its pyramids and plazas thousands of years before the Inca. Watson Brake predates Egypt's Great Pyramids, but it's not the capital of an empire. It looks like people coming together for ritual and gathering, then melting back into the forests and floodplains. If civilization were a single staircase, all of this would be out of order. It would be wrong. But if instead of a staircase, you picture something else, a field of lights, turning on, fading, and sometimes going completely dark, then flaring up again somewhere else, suddenly the picture makes more sense. Humans didn't move in a straight, single-file line from primitive to advanced. We experimented, over and over, in different climates, with different resources, under different skies. Sometimes the experiment was a stone temple for unknown gods, built by hunter-gatherers. Sometimes it was a city with sewers and standardized bricks, but no obvious kings. Sometimes it was a fragile fishing village on what is now the bottom of the North Sea. Sometimes it was a ring of stones that captured the sunrise on the longest day of the year. And many of these experiments failed or ended quietly, or were simply abandoned. Not because the people were stupid, not because they didn't figure it out, but because rivers moved, rain patterns shifted, trade routes dried up, forests died or returned, seas rose, or because the people themselves decided they wanted something different. Our old story imagines people in the past as simple, and people now as complex. But go back in your mind to one of those lost cities, a woman in Çatalhöyük, waking up in a room painted with ochre and animal figures. The air smells like smoke, clay, wool, and drying grain. She climbs to the roof, walks to a neighbor's house, steps through a skylight into another family's life. She knows 20 cousins by name, 3 different weaving patterns, and the seasonal schedule of at least 10 plants. She can butcher an animal, repair a clay wall, and follow social rules that regulate marriage, trade, religion, and conflict, none of which are written down. Is that simple? Or think of an Indus Valley craftsman measuring bricks so precisely that thousands of them will fit together across an entire city. He understands kiln temperatures, clay types, proportions, and geometry, all inside a culture that somehow coordinated cityscapes without leaving behind loud monuments to individual rulers. The distance between us and them is not intelligence. It's not imagination. It's not the capacity to organize or to dream. The difference is technology stacked upon technology, layer upon layer, and the brutal fact that they had less time. Their experiments were interrupted more often by climate swings, diseases they couldn't understand, and natural disasters that wiped whole regions clean. These forgotten cities bring us something else too: humility. It's easy to stand in a modern metropolis, surrounded by glass and steel and light, and imagine we are the apex, the final stage. All the earlier attempts were just practice rounds. But imagine a future archaeologist, 10,000 years from now, uncovering the ruins of our own cities. Will they see us as the pinnacle, or just another experiment, another pattern in the long rhythm of rise and fall? Doggerland was once dry land, full of hunters and gatherers, maybe even people building seasonal camps that came back year after year. Now it's under the sea. Nothing to mark it but scattered bones and stone tools trawled up in fishing nets. If an entire habitable continent-sized region can vanish from human memory in 10,000 years, how much more might be missing? There could be settlements buried deep under river sediments, under the Amazon's forest floor, under the Saharan sand. There could be coastal villages, perhaps even small cities, submerged on continental shelves that are now far below the waves. We might already be seeing hints in odd places. Under Antarctic ice, radar sometimes reveals old river systems, ancient landscapes that were once ice-free. In deserts, satellite images pick out geometric shadows that might be walls, canals, or fields. On the seafloor, sonar finds drowned shorelines carved when the ocean was lower. Most of it is probably gone forever. Organic materials decay. Mudslides. Glaciers grind. The archaeological record is not a full story. It's more like a handful of charred pages from a book that once had thousands. But even with those fragments, a pattern emerges. Wherever we look deep enough and patiently enough, we find evidence of the same things. People gathering, people building, people creating symbols, rituals, alignments with the sky, people negotiating how to live together and what to do with power, wealth, and belief. Göbekli Tepe's animal-carved pillars, the wall paintings of Çatalhöyük, the carefully laid bricks of Harappa, the stepped mounds of Caral, the stone circles scattered around the world, all echo each other. They say, humans everywhere seem pulled toward meaning-making, toward beauty, toward some sense of the sacred. In some places, that took the form of massive temple complexes. In others, it was painted skulls and buried ancestors under the floors of homes. In others, it was quiet alignments of stone and sun, mapping the year in light and shadow. Civilization is not just writing in kings and empires. It's any sustained attempt to weave individual lives into something larger, through trade, ritual, shared stories, shared spaces. By that measure, the line between before civilization and after civilization blurs almost completely. Instead of a sharp dividing wall, we get a long, sloping hill, covered in experiments. Some were gentle and egalitarian, some were rigid and hierarchical. Some lasted centuries, some burned out in a few generations, but they are all part of the same unfolding. The same long attempt to figure out what humans can be when they gather in groups larger than a single band. And we are not outside that story, we are inside it. When you walk through a modern city, under lights timed by satellites, past buildings planned by computers, you are moving through just one more version of the same hey-old puzzle. How do we live together? How do we share resources, coordinate effort, and give our lives meaning? How do we face the sky, the seasons, and the certainty of death, and still find reasons to build? We inherit their tools in ways we don't even see. Grids and streets echo Indus cities. Monuments and ceremonial plazas echo places like Caral and Göbekli Tepe. Domestic shrines, family altars, quiet grave goods, all reflections of impulses that began tens of thousands of years before anyone wrote a single word. And there is one more thread, faint but persistent: forgetting. Over and over, humans build things, tell stories, create worlds of meaning. Then the climate shifts, the river moves, the trade collapses, or a new people arrive. The old stories fade, foundations are reused, stones are scattered, names are lost. We are living on layers of earlier lives we barely remember, somewhere under a farm field, under a suburb, under a shopping mall or a forest. There may be the ghost of a settlement that once thought of itself as the center of the world. Just as we often think of ourselves, these forgotten cities don't just expand our timeline, they change the feeling of that timeline. Instead of a straight road, think of it as a vast, dimly lit landscape. Our headlights only reach a little way, illuminating Sumer, Egypt, Greece, Rome, the familiar signposts. But beyond that circle of light, there are older roads, older fires, older gatherings. We are walking through the dark, holding a very small lamp, surprised each time it catches a megalith, a buried city, a drowned plain, and somewhere out beyond the edge of the known, under ice, under sand, under ocean, there are still more surprises waiting. Evidence of other experiments, other ways of being human that will force us, again, to rewrite what we thought we knew. For now, all we can do is lie here in our brief moment and let the scale of it sink in, not as something frightening, but as something strangely comforting. We are not the beginning. We are not the end. We are one chapter in a book so long most of its pages are missing, but the parts we can read already tell us something simple and profound. Humans have been clever, creative, spiritual, and socially complex for far longer than our tidy histories admit. We are the descendants of builders whose names we'll never know, walking through cities whose shapes they helped imagine, guided by stories that echo faintly from temples now collapsed and plains now drowned. When you think of yourself that way, as a brief flicker in a long chain of forgotten cities and remembered dreams, the present moment softens. The anxieties of today shrink a little. You can feel yourself as part of something older, wider, and quieter. A story still being rewritten, even as you drift toward sleep. So now, as the lights of these lost cities fade in your mind, let them drift, just a little, further back. Beyond Göbekli Tepe's buried stones, beyond Çatalhöyük's rooftop doors, beyond the drowned coastlines of Doggerland, the gridded streets of the Indus, the first pyramids on the Nile, the quiet plazas of Caral and the earthworks of Watson Brake, beyond the stone circles and standing monoliths that still watch the sky. Because if there's one thing all of these places whisper to us, it's this: every beginning we know is someone else's middle. Every first city is built on top of an older camp, an older trail, an older dream. And beneath every foundation stone we can still touch, there are stories pressed into the soil that we haven't learned to read yet. The farmers of Çatalhöyük walked over the ash of earlier fires. The builders of Göbekli Tepe carried memories of hunters before them. The people of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro dug wells in ground that had already watched children play for thousands of years. Even the first scribes of Egypt, carving the names of their kings, were writing on top of a past they half remembered and half imagined. Our entire idea of the beginning of civilization is like coming into a long conversation halfway through. We hear a few clear words near the end. We strain to catch the echoes behind them. But most of what was said before has already faded into the background noise of time. And yet, it's still there, in the stray potsherd in a farmer's field, in a submerged riverbank captured on a sonar scan, in DNA that remembers migrations no myth preserved, in the way our cities still rise, still fall, still flood, still burn, still get abandoned and forgotten, only to be rebuilt again. When you walk through your own streets, lit by sodium lamps and LED signs, you're moving through an unbroken chain of experiments in living together. Tents, hamlets, villages, towns, walled cities, megacities, each one trying to solve the same problems. Where do we find water? How do we share food? How do we keep peace? What do we do with the dead? What stories do we tell the children so they know who they are? Tonight, as you lie in the dark, you're part of that experiment too. If you'd like to keep wandering through these forgotten chapters with me, you can gently tap like, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. A quiet dot on the modern map, adding your voice to a conversation that started long before Sumer and will continue long after us. If you want to support this kind of slow, careful storytelling, you can also join the channel as a member here on YouTube. That's completely optional, only if it feels right for you. Just knowing you're here, listening, is already more than enough. For now, let the noise of the present soften. Picture the planet in darkness, as if seen from very far away. Continents like sleeping animals, coastlines blurred by mist. Somewhere under a field, a plaza. Under a modern suburb, a forgotten harbour. Under the floor of the sea, streets that once rang with voices now filled with silt and slow-moving fish. Imagine rain falling on a buried doorway. Roots weaving through the rooms of a house that has not heard footsteps for 5,000 years. Starlight passing over stone alignments whose builders are long gone, but whose shadows still crawl slowly across the ground with every season. Whole cities are down there, wrapped in darkness and pressure and time, dreaming their long, unhurried dreams. Let them sink, gently, into the depths of your mind. Let the known beginnings loosen, revealing the older stories beneath them like faint constellations behind city lights. You can rest now. The past is still there. The cities are still dreaming beneath the earth, and we'll visit them again another night.